Okay, very excited to have Adrian Pocobelli with us today. Adrian is a Gamma Partner artist. He's been creating art on the blockchain using NFTs for some time now. He creates using his phone, he creates physically. He creates really interesting pixel art, which we're definitely going to dive into, and definitely with a serious touch of nostalgia. But enough from me. Adrian, we're finally here. Welcome. Please introduce yourself. Tell your story. You can go right back to when you were a child and how you first started feeling creative. I know in your bio on your website it talks about a certain holiday that you went on, but enough from me. Let's hear it from you.
It's all about the vacations over here. Thanks, Brett, and great to see you. Great, we have everything in working order, seemingly. So again, it's great to. First of all, I'm just excited to be here. Art on Bitcoin to me is the most exciting thing, really, in the blockchain art space, and is remarkably quiet. I would say for everything that is happening. Generally speaking, I'd still say it's like if is there even 10% of the artists that are putting art there is what I mean by that. But to me, that makes it incredibly exciting and an opportunity. As far as my background, to your point, is, the formative experience for me as an artist growing up was going to the Vatican, really, actually going to Rome and Italy when I was 6 years old, 1985, and my dad was from Rome, and it was a family vacation, and I remember being more or less dragged through the different rooms of the Vatican, and not really, when you don't know any of the references, when you're seeing it all for the first time, it was actually fairly dry and boring for a child, but it definitely left an impression on me. It was a place like no other. These days I call the Vatican, on the 14th time or whatever it is, a temple to the mind is really what it is, more than, as much as it is a religious institution and everything, it's really a temple to thinking and the mind. So it left a huge impression. And also as part of that, my late grandfather's stamp collection was given to me, who I never met. He died a couple of years before I was born. And so I had all these amazing kind of small stamps, Italian stamps that also left a huge impression. And these art books, I'd copied little Leonardo, actually as early as 6 years old there, because they were just books that are around when you're in Rome, this sort of thing. So that really got me started. And as my life kind of moved forward, it just always stayed with me, these experiences. And so it was just always kind of top of mind. And so I always wanted to be an artist because it was just such a special place. There was nothing like it. And I grew up in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, a fairly provincial area, agricultural, a city of 300,000 people, maybe 250,000 back in 85, if that. So it always stayed with me. And so, long story short, I started collecting uh, baseball cards after that. And actually, I'm going to put a couple of works on Bitcoin, I think today, kind of baseball card homages. And then I collected hockey cards and then stamps, sorry, and then comic books, and I became obsessed with comics. So I was always obsessed with sort of like the static, basically rectangular or border image. And so that's really. Then I went to art school and ended up doing a master's in English because art school in the late '90s, early 2000s was, for lack of a better term, it was really pretentious. So the brain food I found were in my English courses, where all of a sudden you're dealing with real huge topics like time and consciousness, with the modernists and everything. So Joyce, Faulkner, and whom I don't really read that much anymore, but philosophically was super interesting. And so I ended up doing a master's in English and also doing a lot of ancient Greek philosophy, which I almost did a master's in. And so finally, I did a master's in English, wrote on the Atrocity Exhibition by J.G. Ballard, which is to me incredibly one of the most important books of the 20th century that really hasn't even that people are still trying to crack the code, and so I feel like I've come a long way on that. Anyway, so that is my story up until I was 25, and then finally discovered blockchain. I was actually making digital in 2016 with the iPhone 6S, which I consider the first art phone. That's when I got really into digital because I was working in an office at the Northern Miner, which is a trade newspaper on natural resources. I still work there. I do their podcast weekly. And I started, so keeping my art dream alive, I would go on my lunch hour. I started making art on my phone because it was the only way I could. Necessity is the mother of invention, as they say. And so I was actually pretty impressed. You could export, there were new apps that were coming out, and you could export between the apps. So all of a sudden, you don't need too many possibilities to be able to start making interesting things. And the phone is super interesting because as a compositional tool, it's very small. And so you do a little stroke like this, and your canvas is like half covered. Whereas you do that with a massive canvas where you're painting, that takes you like half a day. So it's really interesting as a compositional tool. I use it often, and so yeah, so discovered. And it's funny. I went to Super Rare in 2019. I had no idea what it was because the big concern before blockchain finally was how to make your art physical. So that you could sell it. And if you look at what I call the first generation of digital art, it's all physical work that you generally see in the galleries because that was the challenge because there's no way of really what I'd say credibly buying and selling it. And then, of course, through investing and through my interest in finance, I got into crypto. And then I finally understood what super rare was, applied and luckily got in before the tsunami of people in 2020, 2021 tried to get in. And and then from there I discovered Tezos and also so Object, that platform, and now Gamma on Bitcoin. So those are the three blockchains, Ethereum, Tezos, and Bitcoin that I'm really excited about from an artist's point of view.
Yeah, there's so much to discuss. I want to rewind the clock and then we'll, move sequentially through it and kind of navigate through what makes Adrian Pocobelli tick. So, obviously now you can credibly trade, inscribe, mint, all of this work because it's tokenized. There's ownership on chain. But back in the day, collectibles were, and still are in the physical world, outside of, let's say, the art world. Baseball cards, like you said, comic books, stamps. Did that early ability for you to collect, do you think it drove you in this direction?
100%. 100%. Like I see them as completely related. Interestingly, it was an obsession with the image, and actually, it was just like an addiction almost to the delight of the image. And so, like for example, again, part of it, it was kind of a benefit more than a bug, a feature more than a bug. Growing up in Saskatchewan and Saskatoon, and we were just outside of Saskatoon on an acreage. So, as I like to joke, just outside the middle of nowhere. I say lovingly to all my friends in Saskatoon. And so what I would do on the weekends, and actually basically in all of my free time, was if it was trading cards, I would like line them up, and stare at them. And then I would rearrange them. I think a lot of people who, collect trading cards or comics will do the same thing with comics. And then you just obsess over like the price guides and like what else you can get, what works, what comics you need to fill your collection. It's quite obsessive, the whole thing. And so that has completely trained my eye in retrospect. And I studied a lot of art history as well. I used to, when my parents would go away, I'd actually set up art books in the house, just on open pages, books on Magritte and Dali, just all over the place. So that it became a part of my just kind of daily vocabulary, visual, vocabulary. And I would just change the page, every few hours or every day, let's say. So yeah, collecting. Yeah, like when I collected a lot on Object. I still do. And yeah, it's completely, I see them as like almost not even like different, even though they are different, but I see them as like a part of the same impulse, shall we say.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I know, for example, with my own kids, the concept of owning a digital collectible for them is the same thing as owning a physical collectible. So we're certainly heading in that direction. What about artistically in terms of the early collectibles that you, I guess, immersed yourself in? And like you said, the art books, the artists, your experiences in the Vatican.
Yeah, that is a great question. So another uh, side to this was going to Chicago, actually, when I was in grade 10. So about 15, 16 years old, going to Chicago. And they have a huge institution there, which the name is escaping me, maybe the Art Institute of Chicago or something like this. And they had a massive Warhol show. And they also had a massive Magritte show. They're like one of these, these gigantic American, institutional retrospectives. And so I kind of lucked out, so the Warhol show, of course, when you're 16, you're kind of all about being cool and what is cool. And to me, that was the coolest, thing I'd ever seen. Those early, 1960s works with, painting a Coke bottle with the drip, going down in black and white, or the, nose surgery, or, and the Magritte, they had Time Transfixed, which is the train coming out of the fireplace. Gigantic painting, just sensational, sensational. So those left a gigantic impression on me and huge influence. And it just was more confirmation from those, and of course I went to Italy again, when I was 11 and whatnot. So it was just more confirmation that this is the kind of place I like to hang out. These are the people I want to hang out with, kind of intellectually, spiritually speaking. These are my people. And yeah, and so it's kind of funny in the sense that it was never really planned. It just was what I was obsessed with. It's not because I decided I had to do this and I'm going to follow this. It was just what I was obsessed with. And, I do this YouTube that's I'm taking a few weeks off right now, but 3 times a week. And it's really informed. So when I'm picking works to show that I show from just like the blockchain art community, I do it with a kind of, for me, which is almost a weird certainty, but it's just from like literally 2 decades, let's say, of just obsession, that I feel like I can just go that one, that one, that one, and just like, and happily, and not go, oh, should I do this one? And, and not ask too many questions about it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And tell me about art school. You use the word pretentious, and then you got your brain food, your stimulation from the English side of things. I'm not super au fait with the Atrocity exhibition. I'm somewhat aware that it's like almost like a scrapbook type book in terms of like lots of different topics, lots of different pictures or information. Yeah, you'll have to fill us more in. Yeah, I guess how has that impacted you as well? And yeah, for the people that have no idea or haven't heard of it, tell us all about that too.
Sure. So the 90s, the art school part. Unfortunately, the humanities have, like, I think there's actually a bit of a crisis in the education in the humanities. And it was a result, in my opinion, of the postmodernism and post-structuralism and this obsession with theory, which, and deconstruction and all of these kind of really seductive ideas. It kind of happens to almost everybody who gets involved. There was a time where I was kind of like wanting to, but kind of the deeper you go, you realize there's kind of, I don't want to say there's nothing there. There's a very important kind of critique that is there, but the writing is almost incomprehensible. And some people would say a lot of it was written in French, so perhaps it has to do with the translations. And it's kind of gone out of fashion a little bit, I would argue, although people still try and push it to a certain degree. So that's kind of what I mean. And what happened with art school in the 90s was kind of like, these, very conceptual and not very aesthetic based, shall we say. So that's why, just simple English literature classes going, this is, James Joyce in the last chapter of Ulysses discussing consciousness and it being fragmented. That I can work with that, right? It's nothing too far out for people to understand. Okay, that reflects my own thinking. Now, in terms of Ballard, J.G. Ballard was basically my biggest influence. Still is. Huge influence. And what was interesting about Ballard, he was a writer. He's considered by some, I think, accurately called the last classic surrealist. Even though his writing, he went to the This Is Tomorrow exhibition. I think it's at Whitechapel or Whitehall in London, which was the first pop art show. He had hung out with Edoardo Paolozzi, pretty well-known pop artist, and went to a lot of the early shows. Did a show of crashed cars in the late 60s, which I think was a response to Ballard's Crash. Warhol's Crash. He eventually wrote a book called Crash. So the Atrocity exhibition was written in the late 60s, published in 1969-70. And what was interesting about Ballard was his biggest influences were the surrealists, were artists. And so for me, what's always been interesting, I have a writer who's basically my biggest influence as an artist. And so it's kind of a full circle in my own kind of mind. And yeah, I think Ballard, people are still trying to figure out, are trying to still work out what his work means and what it signifies, but it's holding up quite well over time. And now academia, when I wrote on it, the Atrocity exhibition in 2004, it was not particularly, I had to convince people. Let's put it that way. I had to convince the professors that this was a good idea. Whereas in now, I don't think you'd have to convince very hard. I think it would be kind of, that's a good idea or that's an acceptable idea. Whereas I really had to convince them.
And yeah, you said he was influenced by artists himself, and then his writing influenced you. How did his writing influence you artistically? How did it guide you or impact you or maybe affect the way in which you create or the way you think about creating?
This is a very interesting point in discussion, which is Ballard had an underlying philosophy that basically I think the scholarship, I'm actually working on, putting that together as a kind of written thing. But basically he had an underlying philosophy that I think the scholarship is still trying to figure out. But it's kind of like, I was obsessed with comics and trading cards. I was also obsessed with Ballard. It was all I would talk about with my friend in Saskatoon, who introduced me actually to Ballard, Brian Kotz out of Saskatoon, who introduced me to a lot of the counterculture and the works of J.G. Ballard. So so in terms of the influence, put it this way. The Atrocity exhibition, not to get too far in the weeds, he used Ballard saw the world that we are in as being, because of the rise of the mass media that occurred after World War II, as being basically a world that was overwhelmed by fiction and that had become more surreal than the surrealist paintings, right? And so the techniques of surrealism, which at the core was a kind of Freudianism, it was kind of a Freudianism applied to external reality rather than to the dream, became the most useful tool to really analyze the world and reality and what to make of reality. And so for Ballard, interestingly, he saw the writer's role as someone who invents the reality rather than someone who's adding to the fiction. It was actually Freud saw it, and Ballard after saw, the synthetic, the creation of fiction as being kind of less mature than the analytical looking at reality and trying to understand what's going on. Kind of what you might consider, a novel versus the news. You might consider to be, in Freudian kind of terms, would be considered a more mature kind of. And so Ballard kind of applied that. And the Atrocity exhibition is his attempt at actually trying to express, using fiction, this new kind of novel that he's working on, where really trying to establish a kind of reality within this world that was becoming overwhelmed by fiction.
That's fascinating. That's something that I'll definitely have to dive more deeply into. But no, I hear what you're saying. And then, I guess, is that a story that you're trying to portray in your own art as well?
Yeah, I do have a series called, which the general, it's called Stories, but really it's right now on Object. I have something called The Secret History of World War III, where I take screenshots of the news, and sometimes I'll rewrite the news. Sometimes I'll edit the words in the news, and then I put kind of painting over top that is sampled, kind of like a visual hip hop sort of thing. So sampled brushstrokes from famous painters, and zooming in where you can't even recognize, just like someone would take a James Brown sample, or Run DMC would take a James Brown sample, and you might not, you might know where it's from, you might not, right? Or a drum hit or whatever. And so I do that in certain stories, certain artworks. I also have a series called Related Images, where where I was taking screenshots of Google Images, right? And where I'd put a search in, say, like for, Raphael, Madonna, and Child, and you'd get a certain painting, you'd click on it, and then you'd see all these different versions of that painting, right? And so taking a screenshot of that, and then I would find those works and then put the high-res versions, replace them, and remove the text, and then just juxtapose them. That's ways that Ballard directly influences me, because it's coming to a kind of, it's the writer as scientist, the artist as scientist. It's because when you see the results of a Google search juxtaposed, you start to see how technology, in other words, Google Images, mediates this artwork for us. I'll never forget the Bellini's Doge, which is in the main museum. I'm trying to remember the main art museum in Trafalgar Square there in London. The National Museum, I believe it's called. And I'll never forget seeing the Bellini Doge, because I saw it and I was like, oh, you mean it's green? Because the background, or grayish green, whereas the ones I saw online, I thought it was blue, right? So technology mediates art to us, the history of art to us, and so say Related Images is a commentary on that. And to me, it just kind of, I'm very proud of that series. I've started actually just putting out works on it again, because it encapsulates to me the Google era in one thing. It has the algorithm basically showing and how the algorithm is transforming information, right? And so for me to juxtapose all these works really based on a screenshot is really analytical. It's showing the reality of the technology at work.
And in this digital age in which we live, people, it obviously can be pertained more broadly with like fake news or perhaps like AI representations of things. You never know if you're looking at the correct thing, like you said, or even the correct color. That makes me wonder whether some of the work that you do, for example, I'll pull up, the pixel art sketchbook to start with. Are you trying to capture history? Are you trying to, say this is what things looked like or what things were? Pixel art's very nostalgic as well, obviously, and we can talk about the colors that you choose. You and I have spoken about how they're related to creating, in the physical world as well. But yeah, is there any of that coming through in these works?
Yeah, I would say, like, in a sense, what you see, say, is, you'll see screenshots of the news say from my iPad, where I'll start to just kind of fill in and use, those as a source, a reference point, to highlight, what I would call icons from our common vocabulary, is how I would put it. And then also I have here just still lifes that I have, as you see in front of you. The chair, I love the chair. That went to Daggy D. And Patricio, my cousin's dog. Sometimes I also just I love doing just actually still life sketches, which, the pool there, the palm tree. So yeah, pixel art for me has really become a really fresh way of attacking or approaching traditional subject matter of, say, just even a still life. And then what you see in, say, some of those gray works are screenshots of the news, whether often the Daily Mail. You see a couple of works called Caravaggio 1 and Caravaggio 2 in front at the top there. That's a big New York Times review of a Caravaggio show. And so I have some of the New York Times text over top at the bottom of this massive show that I believe was in Rome, actually, earlier this year. There's also Walmart, that's from Market Watch, and there's something from The Sun, a woman in an elevator, kind of tabloidy. There's a couple of AI girlfriend sketches that I have on the second row there that appear on my Instagram as ads. There's Christie's work there of a pipe that you might see of a contemporary art sale, and another ad there just of shoes. So yeah, so it's kind of commentaries really on how, say in Caravaggio's case, what these, using art as a way to take a step back and recontextualize and analyze what we're looking at here, right? Whether it's Caravaggio in the New York Times and how it's being presented to us, or tabloid news, or something from the Daily Mail, some salacious nightlife, Jeff Bezos at the club, so all that sort of stuff.
For sure. And as we, then pull up nostalgia studies, it's in the title, it's nostalgia, but also, we can comment about inscribing it on Bitcoin, but we can see Star Wars and, some of the other pieces here, the Lego figures. It's like capturing almost a truth or capturing a history, and it's being inscribed on Bitcoin, because who knows in the future if, when people look back, be like, this is what Star Wars looked like, or this isn't what Star Wars looked like. But, hopefully people realize that this is what Star Wars looked like, looking at your art, for example.
Yeah, I hope so. Like, in a sense, what's going on behind the Nostalgia Studies series is really, it's a homage to what I get tempted to call, perhaps overstating a bit, like an unrecognized canon of design that existed in the 80s. And so you see it with Star Wars figurines. Classic space Lego boxes are just these masterpieces of design. You also see there's a lot of Ultima 4 screenshots, a classic, one of the early RPG games that I had on the Apple IIe, again, when I was like 5-6 years old. My mom brought home the Apple IIe. She was in IT back in the early 80s. And that, I consider Ultima 4 like an early masterpiece, actually, of digital art. There, you see I'm celebrating the 5.25-inch floppy disks of Ultima 4. Also Lode Runner, I'm a big fan of, and each level had a different kind of visual structure. I'm convinced that the reason we still like these games, or a lot of the reason we are drawn to retro games, it's not the gameplay. Like, when I go back to Ultima 4, I'm actually pretty bored if I start to play it. But if I look at screenshots, it's the visual aspects that really carry us through the day, so to speak, that are really keep our attention over the decades. And so what I'm doing in this series is celebrating and, to a certain degree, giving homage to the design of whether it's these Lego boxes or these beautiful video games, screenshots from these beautiful video games. So that's what's really going on there, or like those Star Wars action figures. Again, it really was a moment in the 80s, and even in comics. You could argue it went from the 1940s all the way to about 1992, and something happened where all of a sudden Lego boxes didn't look as good as they used to. Star Wars, like comics didn't look as good as they used to. Trading cards stopped, like their designs started to just not have that same classicness. And I have a small theory on that, which is, ultimately, like Stan Lee wanted to be a novelist, one of these great writers Amazing Spider-Man 1 to 100, I consider one of the great novels of the 20th century. He would want to be a novelist, but I think part of the problem is what happened is people who grew up on comics all of a sudden started writing comics rather than having these kind of grander ambitions or reading Hemingway. Instead, they were reading Stan Lee's Spider-Man, which is nice, but they didn't have the same, it was a little bit, it got a little nerdy in the true sense. And so I think that's what happened. There were people who just grew up on trading cards, wanted to make trading cards, but they didn't have all of these other references that maybe those original trading card designers had, which were probably more classical. And same with Lego boxes, So yeah, so it's kind of an interesting, yeah. Or it's some people say, Adrian, you're just nostalgic. Those are just the things you grew up with, which is like maybe.
Yeah, I somewhat agree in both parts. I think it's so interesting that humans have this yearn for or not even necessarily to go back, but just this, uh, yeah, this feeling that we get when we see nostalgia, when we look at your art, for example. It takes me back. I was a 90s kid. I was born in the 80s, and I remember comics and Mad magazines and playing with early Lego and and then you want to show that off to like your kids if you have them, or other people who are around. And I feel like you're doing that with your art, and you're also preserving it because it's on Bitcoin. That can't be erased. It's almost like preserving not almost, it is like preserving a memory. I alluded to it, and you mentioned earlier you create, and you used to create physically. You probably still potentially do. Tell us about the color palettes and how they're related.
Yeah, so if you'll notice, say in a lot of those works, there's maybe two colors, right? Say they're brown or there's a gray. There's not that many colors, and that's partly due to the limitations of, say, or the expense of putting art on Bitcoin, because of course it's more expensive than most chains if you're inscribing an ordinal, and so every kilobyte matters, right? So you're really trying to make works that are really less than 100 kilobytes, but really less than even 60 kilobytes. And the smaller, the better from a cost perspective. Let's put it that way. And so pixel art really lends itself well to this to Bitcoin, because it makes very small files. Like a lot of the files you'll see here, these are synths, kind of a retro. You see a lot of nostalgia in my work. These retro synths in the Bit Synths series. You'll see limited color palette, and a lot of them are between 5 and 15, 20 kilobytes, these works, which is tiny. And the reason I'm able to make them so tiny is because of pixel art. If I put gradients in there and I'm not doing, these are like maybe 300 to 600 pixel wide works, right? They're not huge. So as part of that, the less colors you use, the smaller the file. And so other than that, the colors, say, in this series, they're also, it harkens back to my physical work where I'd made a lot of drawings on paper, and you'll notice like that orange, if you make art on paper, these are like classic colors you'll find at the art supply store of, background colors to start with when you're doing a work. And I've learned to really embrace these colors. They give a lot, if you put all these works on white, they're not going to have the same character. So it's quite powerful. So that's part of what's going on there in terms of the colors. I guess finally, yeah, I do have my own color palette. As one of my artist friends has said, I didn't really notice it, but one of my artist friends is like, you definitely have your own palette, which is interesting. So yeah.
Do you think that palette is something that's evolved, or have you always just been drawn to those colors?
That's an interesting question. I think it's a result of what is it a result of? It's probably just a result of, I think, combination. It's almost like style. It's literally something that's hard to put your finger on. It's something I do intuitively. So it's not like I go strategically, like I need to make this kind of work. If I'm working on a nostalgia study, I often will just start with an orange. Maybe I'll change it to a brown or a gray, or I'll do an in between, do a 50% on the orange to see what I get there to get a richer gray, And so I use layering. So it's really about the synthesis of all the colors in relation, the colors as a system. Ultimately, is kind of where I guess my style, comes in uh, from a palette perspective.
And tell us about your physical creating, creating physical works in comparison to getting the phone out or whatever tooling you're now using to create this digital art that is pixel art. So are you still creating? Are you still painting? Are you still drawing? Or is it all digital now?
It's really hard to go back to the art supply store and spend $100 on materials and have to go back the next day to spend another $100 to get whatever materials, spend half your day traveling just in your car or on a subway or whatever you're doing, when you can just open your iPad or your phone for free and feel like you're making cutting edge works that you can put on Bitcoin that are going to be stored, theoretically forever, that have a marketplace that's ready to buy, that you don't need to ship, that you don't need to go to the post office to send. I mean, so I love the idea and I want to make physical art, but I am, it's always just so much easier to make digital art, and it's so exciting. I'm kind of back to Bitcoin being such an exciting place to make art that what am I doing? I ask myself if I'm off. So I want to do it. I think there's credibility that's built by having physical work. I think it's important as an artist to have physical work. It shows range, it shows depth, it shows you're really serious, I would argue, as an artist. Okay, you have works for people's homes, but beyond that, as far as just making work and selling it, I can make a work by the time I get to the art supply store. You know what I'm saying? So it's hard to, yeah. So I plan to, but not right away.
No, I feel you. It is a bit of a mind boggle, isn't it? Because if you think nostalgically, you're like, oh, I love that physical art, but digital art is the new art collecting, and you can display it on your walls as well. I have a frame up, in my office, a digital frame. So yeah, we're heading in that direction, but I still obviously love both. So Bitcoin, away from art, and then we'll move to art because then putting art on Bitcoin is going to be the natural kind of progression in this question. But what drew you to Bitcoin in the first place? And then obviously now the ability to preserve, to store, to inscribe all of those beautiful verbs of your creations on Bitcoin is very special because of Bitcoin.
Yeah, Bitcoin to me is the most attractive, seductive. It's seductive, really, place to put your art. I mean, it's the oldest blockchain, or it's the oldest crypto. It is the most respected. It is, accepted by the largest players in finance. It has real respect. So, and it's over $120,000 is, or whatever it is today, maybe 115, whatever it is. It's kind of earned its credibility. So what's interesting, I find it interesting how putting art on Bitcoin, again, how small it is, and it's not tiny, but considering what I consider the opportunity and what it is, you go, and I'm thrilled as an artist. I don't want the world to be, but I think from a collectability point of view, there's also just, as you mentioned, the durability. Part of when you make a work, and this is the thing, like you take a big enough perspective, why are you making physical work? Like, is your piece of paper going to be survive the next 1,000 years? Like, maybe. But with Bitcoin, you can start to, who knows, maybe quantum computing, who knows, but you have a pretty good shot. Put it this way. if you're going to make a bet, of keeping a work and intact for the next 500 years, what's your bet going to be? When you think how much money is in Bitcoin, was it a couple of $1 trillion? I don't know. So I, so it doesn't mean you necessarily put everything there, but again, that's part of the seduction. And you go look at, okay, we're going to be flying, probably leave the planet at a certain point, and are we going to be carrying our paintings onto our spaceships? No, probably not, but are we going to be able to send Bitcoin back and forth or something? Probably, right? So that's again, so it's always back to, so put it this way. It's kind of like when they describe a website, go mobile first. As an artist, I've become digital first. It's more important to me. I start digitally and then I go, okay, how could I have an iteration of this concept in physical form? Right. And as I like to, my kind of tagline is traveling through the mediums, which I think is the most interesting discussion in contemporary art in the last 30, 40 years, is going from one medium to another medium. So for Warhol, it was, okay, there's a small picture of Goethe from a book that I'm going to take a picture of. I'm going to blow it up. Then I'm going to screen print it, or actually then I'll trace it with graphite, blow it up, screen print it. And so you're traveling through all these mediums, and there's an alchemy that happens when that happens. So all to say, as far as Bitcoin is concerned, it's really the durability, the storage, the quote unquote permanence.
Yeah, I feel you. It's a really interesting and unique proposition. And like you said, I hate the crypto cliche that it's early, but it truly is. And as Bitcoin goes up in price, as we all suspect it will, even at the lowest fees, as Bitcoin goes up in price, that lowest fee still costs more. 1 sat per VByte costs X now, and if we go 2X, then it costs 2X at exactly the same fee rate. So it becomes harder and harder to, obviously, like, if you really want to preserve your work, you'll pay for it, but it becomes harder and harder to do that. So speaking of the collection that you're going to be releasing, putting up for sale, Pixel Art Inferno, based on Dante's Inferno. Again, for those who don't know much about that story, please fill us in. We can see so much of you. You're telling the story through your art, like we can see the different themes, but again, it's your color. We get this almost stylized border we talked about with collectibles earlier. There's a lot of, Pocobelli in here, but yeah, tell us about this collection and, really dive in.
I love how you pointed that out, and indeed, yeah, there is a lot of Pocobelli in there, and I'm glad you mentioned actually the borders. That's almost kind of a homage to a certain degree to like these 13th century, 14th century type of illustrated manuscript kind of style. That's what I was thinking there. You'll see they're little bones actually in the that are joined together. As far as the entire work, so I was reading Dante's Inferno, and what was interesting about it, I watched some lectures on it, and it was the first time that I had ever really read it in a serious way. I'd read it once before, but I didn't understand about most of it, let's say. But this time I took the time, watched the lectures, and started to understand it. And what was interesting is it's a very visual poem, the Inferno. And so what was interesting is I would have an image in my head, and I realized, I can make a series here. I've done it before with the Peloponnesian War, which is a work I put on Ethereum, Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. I did 200 trading cards, basically. So it's kind of in that spirit. It's something I had done before, and I was like, I can do pixel art here. I can do 2 colors, and I can put it on Bitcoin, and it'll be 5 kilobytes, these files. Most of these files are between 3.5 and 7 kilobytes, right? They're 250, maybe 260 by 260, and they're from the imagination, which is different for me because most usually I'm appropriating, I'm taking screenshots, I'm using references from the news, whatever. What was really liberating about this series was it was coming from my head. And at first, I started to look at a few references, seeing what other people had done with the Inferno, and then I realized I didn't want to see any of it. I looked at a little bit. Okay, what did Blake do? What did this other artist, from the 14th century do? And I realized I didn't want to see any of it, and I just wanted to go purely from my own mind. And so that's one of the most liberating things I've done as an artist, and it actually makes me way more proud. It feels like a real contribution to that tradition of, visualizing or depicting, each of the cantos, which is what I did here, of the Inferno. And of course, there's great artists have done this. There's a great tradition of it. There's Rauschenberg, there's Dali. So I put my own spin on it here. And so you have 34 works here, one for each canto.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We can see obviously some of the darker themes that we saw Cerberus. We can see the devil. There's like gluttony and sin, and and always, as we know, when you read a book or a poem, any piece of literature, the mind's eye definitely goes places. That must have been a fascinating experience for you.
It was. It was, again, it was so fun. I have to say, like, it's very enjoyable to make a work purely from your imagination. And then to, actually, and if you stop there, Brett, you'll see, and to put it on the page, because if you stop there, this is actually kind of a hilarious example. You'll see the winged figure on the bottom left, second from the left. And that's a monster that's like maybe in the 17th or 18th bulge. What is it? Canto 18. And what's funny is I thought there were wings on this monster that takes you down a level. And so I drew it with wings and everything. But then I looked at the actual, what did Blake do? And there's no wings on the monster. But I kind of like that because that's what I saw, while I was reading it. So it was very much this transcription of, like, they're very close. Like, I don't want to say they're exact or anything, but they're fairly close to my images that I was trying to depict. Like, I was actually quite happy with that process of, you have a memory of what happens, or a vision, so to speak, or you visualize it, you put something down, and then you kind of marry what you're putting down on the page with your imagination and what you see. And there's this kind of conversation. I was quite happy with how, basically, what felt like how close they came to depicting. Like, to me, it was like, this is a honest depiction, like a good depiction of what I was seeing, which surprised me. I didn't think I'd get as close as I did, is how I'd describe it.
And tell us about that process. Is it one go, or do you come back to it? Do you sort of draw, one of these cantos, like you said, just and then finish it, or is it ongoing?
That's a great question. Some of them come together faster than others, but I'll start. One of the things you learn is to kind of start big and loose. Like, when I learned realist painting in Toronto over a few workshops. And really the way that you academically approach drawing is you kind of put in big pieces and you don't worry too much about, you try and get your proportions right. And then you kind of slowly zoom in with the details later. And you kind of get more detailed once you're kind of happy with your general proportions. Then you start to add details from there. Whereas the amateur will just start drawing the face and the nose and whatever. And then all of a sudden it's completely in the wrong place of the image or whatever. So I did apply interestingly traditional, protocols, so to speak, to drawing here in these works. I'm trying to recall your question. What was your question again?
No, I think that you were heading in a lovely direction, and I was more curious about, do you finish, do you start and then finish, or do you come back to them?
Thank you.
Is it one go, or are these edited?
It's multiple. Yeah. So generally I'll start a work and I'll probably get on a good day, I'll get 80% there. and then I'll stop and put it away. I have to say, but generally it's maybe 3 or 4 sessions, let's call it, that it takes to make one of these works. And so some of them come together faster than others. But generally, maybe even 5 or 6, sessions when you're looking at doing the final cuts and you're looking at every pixel, right? And you're going, should this be here? Should this not be here? Are there any quote unquote errors? But keeping the looseness at the same time. So yeah, I mean, so these are like paintings in the sense that you return to it. This isn't a one and done sort of scenario. This is something where, 4 or 5 coffee shop sessions, so to speak, and then the final, edit master, so to speak, is formed when it's launched before inscribing.
Of course. I love that. It sounds very romantic, sitting down with a coffee, getting your, the Apple Pencil perhaps out and the iPad or, whatever you're using on your phone and doing some drawing. Adrian, technology didn't kill us this time. We got there. It's been a wonderful pleasure to chat with you and dig a little bit deeper. We're looking forward to the release of this collection, whatever else you bring to Bitcoin. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Brett. And I'm so pleased to be a partner artist on Gamma. I really look forward to putting out some editions and a whole lot more work. Actually, I'm going to mint some work today. I'm really excited about it. So thank you for asking me, and thank you for just having me here to discuss my work. It's a pleasure, and you guys are doing wonderful work at Gamma. The website's beautiful. I'm really proud to be on there.